Today we're going to take a quick look at the new preview of Visual Studio Code, which is Microsoft's new cross-platform text editor. We'll start with the install. For Windows, it's very simple and pretty much what you've done with every other install. For something a little more interesting, let's look at the install on Linux. Okay, let's pop over to my Ubuntu virtual machine here, running GNU as the desktop environment. Again, we go to code.visualstudio.com. This time it knows we're on Linux and offers us the download for Linux. Tell it we want to save it. Give it about 5 seconds or so, depending on your network speed. That last second's a killer. Okay, so now let's take a look at the documents that tell us what to do next. Click on Docs, come down to Setup, scroll past the Mac, down to the Linux, and here we go. We're going to make a folder and we're going to extract the zip file into it, and that's it. We're going to double click on code and be away to the races. So let's come back over here, go to our downloads folder, extract, go into that folder, double click code, take a breath, and hey presto, now we have code up and running. First thing you'll notice, this is not Visual Studio. You may have thought you were getting a copy of Visual Studio for Linux, but that's not the case. This is a completely new product. It is a text editor with some IDE-like features. The last thing we're going to do to set up for Linux is switch back over to a terminal, bring it off to the side, switch back over to our instructions, and we are going to set up a symlink so that we can fire this thing up from the command line. So let's make sure that we're in the right directory where we installed it, and let's do a pwd so that we can get something we can copy. This gives us the path. We're going to copy that. Now we are going to follow what they've said over here. We're going to sudo make a symlink, paste in that pathway, type in code. We're going to add to it code because that's the name of the program. Then we're going to put that in user local bin code. Okay, so now we should be able to fire it up from the command line. And if we do, as they say over here, do the code space dot meaning the current directory, we should be able to say code dot, and it will fire it up. There's an error message here that I'll show you in just a second, but if we flip into code, we can see that it has now loaded up the directory that we were just in, which is the code directory itself. So if we look at the license.txt, for instance, we click it here, it shows up over here. Now we can edit or read. If we decided we wanted to edit it and we double click on it, now it shows up here as well under working files. This is an interesting approach. In a lot of text editors, you wind up with tabs across the top for the different files that you're working on. They didn't want to do that here, and it's something I really like, is the fact that I have as much space as possible for my code. And so they have instead a working file section on the tree over here. So if let's see if there's anything else. The third party notices. I don't want to open binaries, obviously. So now you see over here, there's only one file apparently open, but now I have two and I can flip between them. Now I can also use the main directory listing down here, but of course that can get a little difficult if it's a large project with lots of subdirectories. So now let's go back and look at that error I told you I would show you. If we come back over here, if we read it, it says running without the SUID sandbox, exclamation point. And it gives us a link here to explain it. Essentially what this means is that when this was built, there was an additional flag that needed to be set. If you go look on the website over here, and look at the FAQ, if we scroll down a bit, we'll see I'm trying to run VS Code on a Linux machine running in Azure. Why am I getting a running without the SUID sandbox error? This is a known issue that we're still investigating. So like I said before, this is a preview release. In the future, this will be fixed. It is basically a matter of them recompiling with a certain flag, like I said, set. Okay, so let's hop back over to code, and I'll show you something else I find kind of nice. Most text editors have some facility for going full screen. And so let's look at this one. If we press F11, what do we get? So what you see here is we've pretty much done away with almost all of the top Chrome so that we have a fair amount of space for our code over here that we can see. I think that's kind of nice. Now that we've finished the setup, we'll hop back over to Windows and take a look at Visual Studio 2015 at a project I've created called Sample Project that is an ASP5 project. I chose an ASP5 project because, at least in theory, we can run that both on Windows and on Linux. It is also in preview mode at the moment, so sometimes things work and sometimes things do not work. But at the moment, let's take a look at the project itself, because what I really want to do is show you Visual Studio versus VS Code. So we have our project here. Let's just open up startup.cs. And we can see over here, just like always in Visual Studio, we get some nice little things like the ability to say configuration and pop up IntelliSense. And we have some, not only some things that we can select to save us some typing, we get little pop-ups with little tips and help and documentation. So let's undo all that. And now let's look at the exact same project in VS Code. So down the side we see that we have our working files. We haven't started editing anything yet, so there's no working files. But we see the same set of directories and files down through here. So let's pick startup.cs, the same one we were looking at a second ago. And we look over here, it looks pretty much the same. The color scheme's a little different, but hopefully that's something that will become configurable. Notice as I hover over something, I get the little pop-ups. So let's come here and try IntelliSense. Configuration dot, hey look, we get the same thing popping up. And it's a little bit different here because it's putting those tips in line as I go down through here. That's kind of interesting. But as you can see, it has IntelliSense as well. And the reason is behind the scenes, we have Roslyn working, compiling things as we go. So on the fly, Roslyn is telling the editor some information about the code. It can introspect that code and see what's there and give us IntelliSense the same way Visual Studio does. Okay, to understand how this works, we have to look at the various components that make up VS Code. Let's take a look at those parts. First is Electron from GitHub. GitHub built an editor called Atom, and it is built with the premise that you have a native wrapper for Windows, Linux, and Macintosh that loads up with a Chromium shell on the inside. So it's the same technology as the Chrome browser. So you can then write your editor in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and deploy this thing to each of the platforms and have what it looks like a native app on each platform. It also includes Node.js under the covers for any sort of processing they need to do. So the next step for GitHub was to split the two and release the shell as Electron. So this is the native piece that loads up and has Node.js. So Microsoft used their technology and combined it with their own code editor called Monaco, which they had released for use online with Visual Studio Online. It's a pretty fair code editor, and so they used that in combination with Electron to give you the basics of the editing experience. Now, to get the Roslyn compiling in the background and showing you IntelliSense and other sorts of info on your code, they've pulled in a project called OmniSharp, which has been around for a while. The idea here is give you a way to edit in several different text editors in a rich sort of way that you would expect from Visual Studio. So if we take a look at the editors they support Atom, Brackets, which is from Adobe, Emacs, Sublime, Vim, and Visual Studio Code. This one up here is just the command line. And so the final piece of the puzzle here is Roslyn, which is Microsoft's .NET compiler platform, which is now completely open source, which in combination with OmniSharp gives us all of the sort of pop-up, IntelliSense help, and also information that we would normally associate even in Visual Studio with the plugin like ReSharper. Let's hop back into code and take a look at a couple more of its features. So we see now that we've actually edited a file, it shows up not only in our working files area, we see over here the little symbol to show us that there's one file that's open in that directory. And now that we're on this, let's look at if we click it, we close up that little lane and give ourselves some more space for our code, which is handy because now we can also do side-by-side splits by clicking the little split right there. Let's open that guy back up and let's see what else we have available to us. If we come on down this lane, we see search, and it's going to work like any other search that you might think of. We say configuration, we hit enter, and we start coming back a list of places where configuration occurs, and we can jump to them just like you would expect. The next one is kind of interesting here, built-in integration with Git. So let's say we want to put this under source control with Git. We can just come here to the Git symbol, click initialize the Git repository, and now it's built as a Git repository that we can commit. It says, hey, look, you have 962 changes. So if we say we want to put in a commit message, initial commit, hit enter, goes out, it does the commit. If we open up the little menu here, we've got sync, pull, push, commit staged, commit all, unstage all, clean all, and show the Git output. So if we show the Git output, now we can see what's actually going on over here. Kind of cool. A quick quibble that I would put on this is that it didn't give us a git ignore file, so it has just added everything. So it's simplistic at this point, but I'm sure they will improve it over time. The last thing that we're going to look at down this bar here is the debug. Now here's kind of an ironic fact. We can't currently in this preview version debug any .NET code. We can debug Node.js code, but not .NET code. The demo at the build conference showed debugging some of the ASP5 code, but that's currently not working in the build that we can get. I'm certain that's coming shortly, so we will take another look at it when that comes out. We'll take a quick look at a couple more things and then we'll wrap up. If you'll notice here, we have 7 references. This is another case where Roslyn behind the scenes is able to use the fact that it's compiled the code and is introspecting running code. So if we right click on configuration here, we see some options. We can peek the definition, go to the definition, which since this is the definition won't help us much, but we can find all references. We could also hit Shift F12 obviously. And now in a very much the way that we get the peek options in Visual Studio, we get the little window open here in line so that we can see a peek or a window into what we're looking for, and we see all the places that that configuration is called. And we can take a quick look at them. This is so if we don't actually want to change it, we just are really literally peeking. We want to see what's going on there. So let's come down to here. If we right click on this guy, app settings, now we can peek his definition because this isn't the definition. So now we see up here the name of the file where he exists and we see where he's declared. So let's pretend we're really in here editing. Let's close this little lane down and give ourselves as much space for our code as we can. And let's look at a couple of things. There we see I hovered over something and it popped up the extended definition. Let's give ourselves some more room so we can see that. So you see that it's pretty nicely formatted there. If we look at the same thing in Visual Studio and we come to Configuration Services, Add Entity Framework, we get the same information, but it's kind of jammed into a tiny little 2-line window. So this is the first place I would say that I think Visual Studio kind of is lacking compared to our friend Mr. Code. To be fair, that's probably the one example I could pull out, but I do like the fact that this gives it more space and formats it a little bit. Atom does a very similar thing. We'll look at that in another video. The last thing I'm going to point out here is that Visual Studio Code is following a trend of a lot of modern text editors such as Sublime Text, in that we have a very easy key combination to open up our little magic line where we can just start typing the name of whatever we're looking for. So if we wanted to open a folder, we just literally start typing open and then folder. Or we can look for just about anything. If we said git, we could say execute git commands. In which case we could literally put some information here directly, like if we wanted to say we wanted to branch, it allows us to do it directly from here. So that gives us the ability to stay away from the mouse just a little bit. Let's take a look at a couple of nifty features here. First, I've created a file that's a markdown file. If you're not familiar with Markdown, it's a way to write plain text that gets formatted into HTML. For instance, if I would like to have an H1 header, I can make a single hash mark and then my title. Then come down here and write some text. And then let's put a level 2 header. And so you see what I'm doing there, you get the idea. One of the things that's interesting with code is it comes with a markdown viewer. So if we do Control-Shift-V, we get to see what it would look like if it were converted from Markdown into formatted HTML. If we were working on a Markdown document, we could toggle here and have 2 copies of the same file open, and on the one on the right, we set into the preview version, if you will. Then we can start writing over here. Another topic. This is not the first text editor to have this feature, but it's a nice feature to have. So let's close that and let's take a look at something else. If you remember, I told you the text editor itself is essentially web-based. So we have HTML, CSS, JavaScript living inside of Chrome. So with Chrome, we have a lot of really good developer tools for seeing what's going on. Well, guess what? If we go to Help, we can toggle Developer Tools, and look what we've got. We've got the Chrome Developer Tools over here. At the moment, you really can't make your own styles, and you can't really make your own plugins. But you'll see here that it will be pretty easy once we get the option to do so, because this lets us inspect things. So let's say we were going to try to make a theme. If we come over here and we just have to locate what we want to theme. So if we go up a bit until we find Monaco Editor here. This div with the class Monaco Editor VS Dark is telling us what theme that it's currently using. And for the most part, that equates down to a CSS style. So now we can see if we hover, that's selected the section over here. If we come down to his background color, if we delete that and we start cycling through, then you can see now we know exactly which file we need to look at and which style we need to override in our themes CSS, and we can just come here and flip through and see. I'm thinking that's exactly how I want to code my text all the time. But anyway, you can see how easy it's going to become whenever we have a chance to theme our editor with CSS. So let's talk about first impressions. My first impression of Visual Studio Code is that it's a very good start. It's going to be a solid text editor and almost a baby IDE that will be very handy in that we will be able to develop on Windows or Macintosh or Linux. Having said that, what are the problems? Well, obviously, as I've pointed out, it is a preview release, so we can't expect all features to be there. It was a bit surprising that I can't debug anything .NET related, but I can debug Node.js. That was a surprise to me, but not offensive. It's something that I know they're working on, and they'll have it out as quickly as they can. That would really bring us to what I would say is my first criticism, is speed of development. there is only so fast that Microsoft can get this out and add the features that we are all clamoring for. So how do I think that they could improve that situation? Well, to me it's pretty obvious they need to get help. And the way to get help is from the community. And since this is a tool geared towards developers, developers like to build onto their own tool sets. So I think getting the community involved as soon as possible will be key to the success of Visual Studio Code. Number one, the thing they already plan to do, which is open up the ability for us to write plugins. Once we can write plugins and themes, that will be a major step in the right direction. We know for a fact that this is something that they're planning to do, we just don't know exactly when, and my concern is that it will be at a rather slower pace than I would like, because I would like to use this more frequently. The second thing I think is a bigger concern is the fact that they did not choose to open source this product yet. They have open sourced plenty of other products at this point. If you go to GitHub, you can find the new ASP, you can find the core.net, you can find Roslyn, you can find a lot of different products from Microsoft that are being developed in the open with community help and support. And I think that that's going to be really key here, especially if they want this to be successful on other platforms. In my conversations with folks in the Linux community about Visual Studio Code, they expressed several concerns. Number one is they don't trust Microsoft. In addition to attracting the Linux crowd, open sourcing the software will allow the community of developers to be even more involved, and I think that would give this tool a real chance at success. So there you have it. It's our first look at Visual Studio Code. It's the new text editor from Microsoft. It is in the Visual Studio brand line, but it is not a version of Visual Studio. At this point, it's a really good start on a product that I think will be increasingly interesting over time, especially if they open source it and get the community involved in plugins and themes. But I would not choose it as a daily driver at this point, and I don't think Microsoft would suggest anyone do so. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing how this progresses over the next year or so. Hopefully it will take off very quickly if they can get community support. And I'm very curious to see if it grows quickly into something that could become my secondary editor of choice that I use in concert with Visual Studio. So that's it for today. If you liked the video, give me a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. If you want more content of this sort, subscribe to the channel, and I'll talk to you later.